TestNG tests break up into nested classes. Thought for a few seconds. Here is your same structured, beginner-friendly content. 4. TestNG tests break up into nested classes. Intermediate level. Test organization and maintainability. Introduction. As test suites grow, test files can become too long, hard to read, difficult to maintain, confusing to navigate. When many related test cases are placed in a single class, it becomes harder to understand. What is being tested? Which scenarios belong together? How setup is shared? How failures are organized? To solve this, developers often break tests into smaller, logical groups. One useful organization technique is grouping related tests into nested classes. At the intermediate level, understanding TestNG test breakup into nested classes means learning how to organize large test classes, how to group related scenarios, how nested structure improves readability, how to design maintainable test suites. What does break up into nested classes mean? Breaking TestNG tests into nested classes means dividing one large test class into smaller inner classes, where each inner class represents a specific test area or scenario group. In simple terms, nested classes, smaller grouped test sections inside a larger test structure. Example concept: user service tests, create user tests, update user tests, delete user tests. Instead of putting every test in one flat class, you organize them into logical sections. Why this is important? As applications grow, tests also grow. A single test class may include many scenarios, such as valid input cases, invalid input cases, edge cases, permission checks, exception handling. If all of these are in one flat class, the structure becomes messy. Example concept: too many tests in one class means hard to maintain. Nested grouping helps improve readability, separate scenarios clearly, reduce confusion, make code easier to maintain. What is a nested class? A nested class is a class defined inside another class. In Java, this can be an inner class or a static nested class. Example concept: public class user service tests. Public static class create user tests. Public static class delete user tests. In test design, nested classes are often used to group related tests by feature or behavior. Why use nested classes for tests? Nested classes help organize tests in a meaningful way. Example concept: feature means grouped scenarios means cleaner tests. Benefits include better test structure, easier navigation, clearer grouping, improved maintainability. For example, instead of one class with 40 mixed tests, you can have creation tests, update tests, validation tests, error handling tests. Each group becomes easier to understand. Flat test class versus nested structure flat test class. Public class user service tests. At test, public void should create user successfully. Test, public void should fail when email is missing. At test, public void should delete user successfully. At test, public void should fail delete when user not found. This works, but it becomes harder to manage as the class grows. Nested structure, public class, user service tests. Public, static, class, create user tests. At test, public void should create user successfully. At test, public void should fail when email is missing. Public static class, delete user tests. At test, public void should delete user successfully. At test, public void should fail delete when user not found. This structure makes it much clearer which tests belong together. How nested test grouping helps. Nested grouping improves the way developers read and manage tests. Example concept: grouped tests means easier understanding, means better maintenance. When someone opens the file, they can quickly understand what features are covered, where to add new test cases, where failures belong. This is especially useful in large code bases. Common ways to break up TestNG tests. Tests can be grouped in several logical ways. By feature. Group tests based on feature area. Example: login tests, registration tests, password reset tests. By operation. Group tests based on action. Example: create tests, read tests, update tests, delete tests. By scenario type. Group tests based on scenario category. Example: valid input tests, invalid input tests. Boundary tests by role or permission. Group tests based on user roles. Example: admin access tests, user access tests, guest access tests. Example structure for TestNG. Here is a practical example. Public class account service tests. Public static class create account tests. At test, public void should create savings account. At test, public void should reject missing customer ID. Public static class close account tests. At test, public void should close active account. At test, public void should reject already closed account. This structure keeps related tests together in a clean way. Setup and reuse with nested classes. One concern is how setup methods work when tests are grouped. Example concept. Shared setup means outer class. Specific setup means inner class. You can organize setup like this. Common setup in outer class, scenario-specific setup in inner class. Example: public class user service tests. Protected user service, user service. Before class, public void common setup. User service equals new user service. Public static class create user tests. Creation-related tests. This keeps shared logic separate from test grouping. Important practical note about TestNG. TestNG does not natively work like JUnit 5 nested tests with @nested. So, when people talk about nested classes in TestNG, they often mean one of these ideas. Inner classes used only for code organization. Separate test classes, grouped conceptually, nested helper classes inside a test class. Organizing tests with inheritance or composition instead of true nested execution. Example concept. TestNG nested classes means mostly organization pattern, not built-in nested execution model. This is important because simply placing @test methods inside inner classes may not always behave the way developers expect in TestNG execution. Recommended approach in TestNG. In real projects, the safer approach is usually use separate test classes for execution, use logical grouping and package structure, use helper methods or base classes for reuse, use nested classes only when they help readability and your tooling supports it well. Example concept. Best practice means separate executable classes plus clean grouping. Good example of practical breakup. Instead of one huge class like this, public class, payment service tests, 50+ mixed tests. Break it into payment creation tests, payment validation tests, payment refund tests, payment failure tests. This is often better than forcing everything into literal nested inner classes. When nested classes are helpful. Nested classes are useful when the file is getting large. Scenarios clearly belong under one feature. You want stronger readability. You want to keep closely related helper logic nearby. Example concept. Large test file means structured grouping helps, when nested classes may not be ideal. Nested classes may not be the best choice when TestNG execution becomes unclear. IDE or runner support is inconsistent. Test discovery becomes harder. Separate classes would be simpler. Example concept. Too much nesting means harder execution and maintenance. In those cases, separate test classes are often cleaner. Suggested test organization strategy. A good TestNG organization strategy is group by feature first, split by scenario type if needed. Keep class names clear. Avoid giant test classes. Prefer simple execution structure. Example concept. Clear names plus small classes plus logical grouping equals maintainable tests. Example of better real-world organization tests. User user creation tests.java, user validation tests.java, and user deletion tests.java. Payment creation tests.java, payment refund tests.java, payment failure tests.java. This is often easier to scale than deeply nested test classes. Advantages of breaking tests into nested classes or logical groups. Advantages include improved readability, clearer scenario grouping, easier maintenance, better code navigation, reduced confusion in large test suites. Example concept. Well-grouped tests means easier maintenance, challenges, and limitations. Challenges include TestNG does not fully support true nested test style like JUnit 5 inter-class execution, may be confusing. Too much grouping can overcomplicate the structure. Test discovery may vary by tooling. Example concept. Better organization helps, but execution model must stay simple. Concepts learned. Understanding TestNG test breakup into nested classes helps learners understand how to organize large test suites, how to group related test scenarios, difference between structure and execution, when to use nested grouping, why separate classes are often better in TestNG. This topic is important for building clean, scalable, and maintainable automated tests. Simple definition. TestNG tests break up into nested classes, a way of organizing related TestNG test scenarios into smaller logical groups, often using inner classes for readability or separate classes for maintainability. Final summary. Breaking TestNG tests into nested classes is mainly an organization technique used to make large test suites easier to read and maintain. It helps group related scenarios such as create, update, delete, validation, and error cases into clear sections. However, because TestNG does not provide true built-in nested test behavior like JUnit 5, the most practical approach is often to use separate test classes with good naming and package structure. Understanding this topic is essential for writing clean, scalable, and maintainable TestNG test suites.